Mysterious plagues that shaped history to fall asleep. Could a city die from whispers alone? Could the laughter of children, the murmur of merchants, the oration of statesmen, somehow become a chorus of doom in the summer of 430 BCE Athens? Radiant and proud beneath the gaze of its marble gods, trembled under a shadow invisible to the eye. The Parthenon gleamed in the noonday sun, its columns reflecting the light of a city that had once believed itself untouchable. The streets teemed with life. Philosophers debated in the agora. Women carried amphorae of water from sunlit fountains, and the air smelled faintly of olive oil and incense from the temples. Beyond the city walls, the Peloponnesian War roared, armies clashing, shields ringing, yet within Athens, an even greater enemy was stirring, unseen and patient, waiting for the first faltering breath to betray its presence. It began in whispers. A few sickened first, their foreheads burning, their skin mottled and flushed, their bodies shaking as if 1,000 small flames ran through their veins. The fever did not discriminate. Soldiers who had survived battle fell mid-step. Mothers dropped to their knees beside the cradles of children, their wails piercing the streets. Elders, who had walked through decades of sun and stone, withered into shadows. The city's robust pulse slowed. The laughter of the agora became hollow, replaced by coughing and a murmur of fear. Temples, once vibrant with hymns, became sanctuaries of mourning, altars now serving as resting places for bodies left too heavy for the living to carry. Some said the disease rose from the Nile, carried by invisible vapors or hidden waters. Others murmured of divine vengeance, of gods offended by hubris, punishing the city that had dared to exalt itself above Olympus. Theories spread faster than the disease itself, whispered from mouth to ear as citizens hid in homes that no longer felt safe, and the city, once alive with debate, art, and music, descended into delirium. Some spoke of visions, shadows moving. At the edge of the fevered mind, of voices calling in languages lost to the dead, of dreams where the city itself wept. Pericles, the great orator and architect of Athens' golden age, who had once guided the polis with words that could command armies, who had walked the marble steps of the Acropolis with dignity and purpose, was not spared. He fell within his own home, fever racking his body, and left the city bereft. No council could govern, no philosopher could inspire, no priest could soothe the panic. Courtyards filled with the discarded bodies left unburied, piled in shadowed corners where once children had played. Rats scavenged among the dead, indifferent to the tragedy of human life, and the stench of decay mingled with incense, confusing the living and blurring the line between sacred and profane. Eyewitnesses described the horror with words that trembled. On the page of history, some spoke of madness, minds shattered by delirium, hands clawing at air as if to grasp some intangible salvation. Others spoke of quiet despair, of citizens who simply lay down in their homes and allowed the fever to take them, believing that death might be kinder than the relentless torment of life. And yet, no pattern emerged. The disease was arbitrary, selecting its victims not by wealth, not by power, not by virtue, but by some invisible hand that moved as it willed. Scholars centuries later would debate its nature. Typhus, smallpox, measles, but certainty eludes even the sharpest mind. The city was burned by the plague with cruel precision, yet, as abruptly as it came, it vanished, leaving Athens scarred and hollow. And so, the city stood trembling in its silence. Markets lay abandoned. Empty amphitheaters echoed faintly with the memory of voices that would never speak again. Walls that had once contained life now contained absence, and the air, heavy with dust and incense, seemed to remember the countless deaths. Athens' ambitions faltered. Its cultural heartbeat slowed, its democratic experiment tested by grief and fear. The golden age dimmed, not with the flash of enemy swords, but with the quiet, insidious presence of a disease that no shield could repel. The whispers of the dead lingered in empty courtyards and sunlit temples. In the quiet corridors of the Acropolis were statues of gods gazed without expression. One might walk among the ruins today and sense their presence. A mother's hand, resting on a cradle, a child frozen mid-step, a philosopher's gaze turned toward the horizon, eyes wide with incomprehension. The city itself seemed to breathe in sorrow, exhaling memory and absence in equal measure. For even as the living returned to rebuild, the echoes of the plague remained, shaping the stories they told, the laws they wrote, and the art they dared to create. And so it is that Athens teaches a lesson older than stone and older than marble. The city, radiant and wise, fell not to siege engines or marauding armies, but but to whispers that carried in the blood and sweat of its people. It asks of us a quiet, haunting question. Do the voices of a city ever truly die? Do they vanish with the fallen, or do they linger in the empty agora, the abandoned homes, and the sun-baked courtyards, waiting patiently for memory or misfortune to awaken them once again? To walk among Athens' ruins is to walk among echoes. To see the Parthenon bathed in moonlight is to witness the persistence of both beauty and fragility. The plague claimed bodies, but it could not claim the memory, nor the shadows it cast upon human ambition. And in the silent night, when the wind carries the faint scent of olive groves and ancient stone, one feels the city listening, its whispers moving like an invisible tide, reminding us that even the strongest walls and grandest columns cannot guard against what is unseen, what is inevitable, and what whispers through the ages. Shaping history in its quiet, relentless way, Athens died, yet Athens endured. And in that endurance, in the spaces between stone and shadow, we hear the whisper of mortality, the echo of lives once vibrant, and the eternal question that hangs in the still air. Can a city's soul ever truly rest, or is it bound forever to the memory of its own ghosts? In the summer of 540 to CE, Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, glimmered beneath a sky that seemed serene for the horrors about to unfold. From its marble-paved streets to the glittering domes of Hagia Sophia, the city radiated power, wealth, and devotion. Ships glided along the Golden Horn, merchants called out their wares, and children chased each other in the sun-soaked squares. Yet beneath the beauty, in the quiet corners where the wind carried the scent of salt and incense, an unseen terror lurked, ready to descend upon the city with a precision both cruel and silent. It began quietly, almost innocuously. A few servants fell ill first, their bodies trembling, skin flushed with fever. Then merchants, carrying goods from distant lands, began to collapse mid-step, their eyes wild with delirium. Soon, the priests who tended to the sick were themselves consumed by the invisible hand of death. Some whispered that it was divine wrath, punishment for the arrogance of an empire that sought to rival Rome in glory. Others claimed the disease rode on rats and fleas. Silent passengers aboard the trade ships that linked Constantinople to the far corners of the known world. Whatever its origin, the sickness spread like wildfire, moving through the streets with a terrifying inevitability. The plague did not discriminate. Nobles in silk robes and sandals, artisans at their benches, soldiers patrolling the walls, all fell to its relentless grasp. Chroniclers speak of families barricading themselves indoors. Yet the disease found them regardless, courtyards and public squares filled with bodies piled in hurried graves, while the living navigated a city that seemed to have been emptied of its vitality overnight. Hagia Sophia, a sanctuary of divine presence, became a hall of mourning, its mosaics reflecting candlelight against the pallor of fevered faces. Emperor Justinian, once a figure of unshakable authority, watched helplessly as the city he ruled teetered on the edge of collapse. He issued edicts, attempted quarantines, and called upon priests for divine intervention. But the disease paid no heed to law or ritual. Fear became a constant companion. The cries of the dying echoed through the streets, punctuated by the tolling of church bells, a metronome for the march of mortality. Traders abandoned their stalls, soldiers fled the walls. Even the city's famed fountains ran dry, the water tainted with the scent of decay. Yet amidst the horror, human fragility gave way to moments of quiet courage. Caretakers risked their lives to tend the fevered, carrying food and water through alleys thick with the stench of death. Priests whispered prayers over the bodies left in the open, their voices trembling yet persistent. Children, too young to understand, wandered through streets lined with the fallen, their small hands brushing over stones warmed by the sun, never grasping why the world had grown so silent. The plague eventually waned, though no one could say why. Like a shadow that stretches long before retreating into darkness, it had consumed tens of thousands, leaving Constantinople hollowed and forever altered. Trade routes shifted, populations thinned, and the psychological imprint remained, a silent scar on the collective memory of a city that had once believed itself eternal. The splendor of Hagia Sophia endured, yet it stood as a testament not only to divine ambition, but also to the vulnerability of human life, against forces invisible and unrelenting. Walking through the narrow streets of modern Istanbul, one might feel a whisper of 542, a trace of fear and grief carried upon the wind. The city listens still, its stones absorbing the memory of those lost. And one is left to wonder, can even the mightiest empire withstand the quiet? Inexorable pressure of death, or do all cities, no matter how grand, ultimately bow to the unseen. Constantinople survived, yet its soul bore the shadow of that summer, a reminder that no wall, no army, and no golden dome could shield against the whispers of a plague moving silently through life, carrying with it the fragile pulse of mortality. It was the summer of 1518, with Strasbourg, a city of timbered houses and narrow cobbled streets, awoke to a strange and inexplicable terror. The air was warm and heavy, carrying the scent of baked bread and river water, yet beneath the surface of daily life, an invisible current stirred. In one modest house on the outskirts of town, Frau Trophia began to dance. She did not dance for celebration, nor for joy, but as if compelled by a force she could not name. Her feet pounded the wooden floor, her arms flailing, her eyes wild and unseeing, until the sweat ran down her face and her body shivered with exhaustion. At first, the neighbors thought it a curious affliction, a moment of madness that would pass, but soon others joined her. One by one, more townspeople began to dance, their movements frantic and unrelenting, as if the rhythm had infected them, a contagion of motion rather than disease. Within days, dozens were caught in the same compulsion. The streets became a tableau of desperation, dancers falling mid-step, bodies collapsing, yet rising again to continue their macabre performance. Some collapsed entirely, lifeless, the dance having claimed their strength and, in certain cases, their very lives. The city officials were perplexed. Physicians were summoned, their remedies inadequate, their logic impotent. They prescribed music, believing that the afflicted needed a proper outlet. Yet the plan backfired. Orchestras played, drums pounded, and the dancing multiplied. A wave of hysteria that no law or prayer could quell. Strasbourg became a city caught in a rhythm of terror, its streets echoing with the stamping of feet and the cries of those who could no longer control their own bodies. Scholars and chroniclers debated the cause. Was it divine punishment, a curse upon sinners? Some whispered of ergot, a hallucinogenic mold growing on damp rye, seeding visions and compulsions in the minds of the hungry. Others believed it was the collective despair of a populace on the edge, the madness of a society burdened by famine, disease, and the oppressive weight of authority. Whatever its origin, the dancing claimed lives, yet offered no resolution, no moral. Only the haunting spectacle of uncontrollable motion. The streets of Strasbourg eventually quieted. As mysteriously as the plague had begun, survivors recounted, horror in hushed tones. The memory of falling companions and exhausted bodies burned into their minds, and yet the city endured, rebuilt, and returned to commerce and prayer. But the legend remained, a summer when the city itself seemed possessed, a pulse of collective compulsion that reminded humanity of its fragility. Walking the modern streets, one can imagine shadows of dancers still moving at twilight, their laughter and terror entwined, a ghostly rhythm beneath the ordinary. It whispers a truth both simple and chilling, even in the absence of fever or visible pestilence. The human body and mind can succumb to invisible forces, and history remembers not only what is seen, but what moves unseen through our lives, compelling action, grief, and awe in equal measure. The dancing plague of Strasbourg remains a caution and a myth, a story of the body's rebellion, the mind's surrender, and a city's endurance. And in its quiet, eerie echo, one senses the pulse of mortality not just as a force that takes life, but as a rhythm that shapes the very fabric of human existence, leaving questions unanswered and streets forever haunted by the memory of motion unbound, unstoppable, and inexplicably alive. Venice, the city of water and stone, had long thrived upon its shimmering canals, its labyrinth of bridges, and the murmur of gondolas beneath moonlight. Merchants carried silks and spices from the far corners of the world, and the marble palaces reflected sunlight like jewels upon the lagoon. Yet in the summer of 1575, the beauty of the city could not mask the shadow that crept silently through its streets. It arrived quietly, a thief in the night, hidden among the goods and bodies carried aboard merchant ships from the eastern Mediterranean. And with it came the whisper of death, invisible yet relentless, settling on Venice like a gray mist. The first victims were dock workers, men whose hands had known the weight of cargo and the sting of salt water. They fell suddenly, their skin blistered, their eyes burning, bodies racked with fever and coughing, their breath shallow and trembling. Soon, entire families were consumed, neighbors peering through shuttered windows to see loved ones writhing in fevered delirium. The city's vibrancy dimmed as the stench of sickness mingled with the scent of the lagoon. Markets emptied, inns and taverns, once alive with laughter and song, were silent, their doors barred against both contagion and curiosity. Even the noble families, accustomed to privilege, could not escape Venice, for all its canals and defenses, had no sanctuary from the invisible predator now stalking its people. Physicians, masked and laden with herbs and vinegar, offered remedies that did little more than soothe the ears and smell of the frightened. Temples and churches, their altars heavy with incense and prayers, became houses of mourning. Families buried their dead hastily, bodies stacked in mass graves on the outskirts of the city, while the living watched in silent despair. Some neighborhoods vanished almost entirely, yet, inexplicably, others remained untouched. As though fate had passed judgment selectively, the plague was a painter, sweeping its brush unevenly, leaving some untouched and others entirely erased. The epidemic raged through Venice with a cruel rhythm, and the city's proud authorities were powerless. Councils debated measures. Quarantines were imposed, yet the disease ignored decree and logic alike. Legends began to form among the frightened populace, tales of invisible spirits riding the canal, myths of ships arriving with no crew but carrying death, of divine retribution for sins unknown. Mothers whispered to their children, urging them to hide or pray, while young men and women wandered the deserted piazzas, eyes wide with grief and terror. Yet, even amidst despair, Venice endured. When the plague finally receded, leaving tens of thousands dead, the city slowly returned to life. Commerce resumed along the canals, the gondolas floated once more, and the marble palaces gleamed in the sun. But the shadow remained a memory etched in the stone and water. Chroniclers recorded not only death tolls, but the fear, the silence, the eerie unpredictability of an enemy unseen. Walking along the canals today, one might imagine the mists of 1575 curling among the palaces, carrying whispers of the dead, a faint echo of the despair that once silenced Venice. The plague claimed lives, but it could not claim memory. It taught the city and all who listened to its history that even in beauty and abundance, life is fragile, and the quiet hand of death may move without warning, leaving shadows that endure long after the streets have returned to song. In the end, Venice survived, but forever carries the imprint of 1575. Every ripple on its canals, every echo beneath a bridge, holds the memory of the fevered, of the families lost, of the markets emptied, and of the city's whispered grief. And in the stillness of midnight, one wonders if the shadows of those who danced and died in fever still drift along the water, whispering of mortality, resilience, and the unseen forces that shape human history in ways no law, no prayer, and no gondola could ever contain. The snow had long melted from Moscow streets in the spring of 1654, leaving the city damp and fragrant with the scent of river mud and pine. Merchants opened their stalls along the winding lanes, and children's laughter echoed through the courtyards. Yet beneath this ordinary awakening, a silent, relentless shadow gathered strength. It came without warning, invisible to the eye, moving through villages, towns, and finally the capital itself. By the time its presence was undeniable, the plague had already begun its merciless work, touching the city's proud towers, the gilded domes, and the narrow alleys alike. At first, the sick were few. A laborer collapsed beside the market, gasping, skin flushed with fever and dotted with the early marks of pestilence. Others soon followed, their cries echoing through wooden homes, carried on the wind that rustled the birch trees outside the city walls. Physicians, wrapped in cloth and armed with herbs and holy incantations, were powerless. The disease did not heed authority or medicine. Nobles and peasants alike succumbed, leaving courtyards littered with bodies that no one dared touch. The wealthy tried to flee, carts rattling along muddy roads, but the plague traveled faster than horse or carriage, invisible in the breath of the living. The death toll rose with a cruel rhythm, each day carving new absences into the city's heart. Bells tolled endlessly, marking both time and terror. Mothers hid their children, priests recited endless prayers. Merchants abandoned the stalls that had once overflowed with grain and linen. Families barricaded themselves indoors, but the pestilence would find them, forcing them to confront the horror within their own walls. Chroniclers of the time wrote with trembling hands: fever, vomiting, delirium, swelling, madness, and an almost supernatural inevitability. Moscow streets, once filled with the music of life, became hollow corridors echoing with grief. Whispers of divine wrath and supernatural vengeance spread through the city, mixing with rumors of miasmas rising from rivers, and some even suggested that the famine of prior years had summoned the spirits of the dead to walk among the living. It was a terror not merely of the body, but of the soul, as each victim left behind the echo of absence, a reminder that life's fragility was written not in stone, but in the pulse of blood and breath. As the weeks turned to months, Moscow's population dwindled. Entire neighborhoods vanished from the maps of the living. Streets once bright with market chatter now bore the silence of abandonment, punctuated only by the bell tolling for the next unknown victim. And yet, life slowly returned. Merchants reopened their stalls, children returned to courtyards, and the gilded domes of the Kremlin caught sunlight once more. But the memory of the plague lingered, etched into walls and alleys, in the quiet hesitation of citizens, in the lingering fear that death, unseen and patient, could return at any moment. Walking through Moscow centuries later, one can imagine the shadow of 1650 drifting through the alleys, a faint echo of coughs, prayers, and footsteps that never reached home. The city survived, but it had been scarred, its pulse forever marked by an invisible hand that claimed both life and certainty. And so, the plague of 1650 reminds us that history is not merely written in victories or decrees, but in the quiet, relentless passage of mortality, shaping human destiny as surely as any army, leaving behind a city forever aware of its fragility, and the whispers of the unseen forces that govern life and death alike. London, a city of fog and timber, of narrow streets winding like serpents through stone and shadow, awoke in 1665 to a summer unlike any it had known. The Thames shimmered under a pale sun, carrying the reflection of spires and chimneys, while the cries of merchants and the clatter of horses filled the bustling streets. Yet beneath the familiar rhythm of trade and life, a dark pulse began to stir, invisible and patient, threading through homes, markets, and alleyways alike. It was a terror not heralded by trumpet or drum, but by the subtle signs of unease. A neighbor's cough, a sudden fever, a body found still in a doorway. The plague crept with insidious precision. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A merchant fell ill, a servant's skin blackened, a child shivered uncontrollably beside the hearth. But soon, its reach was vast, touching every stratum of society. Physicians, armed with remedies of rosewater and camphor, were powerless. Their knowledge could not pierce the invisible armor of death. Bells tolled ceaselessly from the cities, churches, each peal a grim tally of the lives claimed, echoing across streets now thick with fear. Entire families disappeared behind locked doors, only to be discovered days later, lifeless, their absence marked by the faint scent of decay seeping through the cracks of shuttered windows. No one was safe. Wealthy merchants barricaded themselves in their homes, hoping gold and silk could ward off the invisible predator. Laborers fled to the countryside, but even the roads were haunted by bodies left to the mercy of scavenging dogs and carrion birds. The streets themselves became dangerous, lined with the living and the dying, a moving tableau of despair. Hospitals overflowed, their makeshift wards filled with fevered bodies and the cries of the abandoned. While the city's economy ground to a trembling halt, markets were deserted, taverns shuttered, and the once lively London squares became cemeteries in miniature. Legends arose amid the horror. Some claimed that the plague was divine punishment for sins hidden in the hearts of men. Others whispered of vengeful spirits, of miasmas rising from the Thames itself, or of invisible hands that struck indiscriminately. Priests carried the dying to mass graves, their prayers mingling with the wails of the living, and children wandered among the dead, too young to understand the fragility of the world around them. Death became a presence, almost corporeal, pressing against every door, filling every shadowed alley. By winter, the great plague of London began to fade, leaving tens of thousands dead, a city hollowed yet resilient. Life returned slowly. The markets buzzed again, children ran once more through cobbled streets, and the Thames reflected sunlight as if mocking the grief it had borne witness to. Yet the memory of that summer endured in the air, in the narrow alleys, in the tolling of distant bells. London would never be the same. Its very soul had been tested, its pulse forever marked by the relentless rhythm of mortality. Walking through modern London, one can imagine the shadowed streets of 1665, the fevered cries, the hollow-eyed survivors, and the bodies hastily buried in pits at the edges of the city. The plague claimed more than flesh. It took certainty, comfort, and innocence, leaving behind the echo of fear that lingers in memory and stone. It is a reminder that even a city of wealth and fortitude, a metropolis of empire and ambition, is never beyond the reach of invisible forces that shape destiny. sculpting history in the quiet, inexorable hand of death. Even today, when fog drifts over the Thames and moonlight glints against its black waters, one can sense the lingering pulse of 1665, the city listening, remembering, and whispering the lesson it learned through fire, fever, and shadow that life is fragile, and the hand of mortality waits patiently, unseen, yet relentless, threading through the heart of even the mightiest of cities. Marseilles, a city of sun-washed stones and salt-tinged air, had long been a jewel of trade along the Mediterranean, its harbors alive with ships and the voices of merchants, its streets fragrant with olives, wine, and fish. Yet in the summer of 1720, an invisible shadow slipped silently from ship to dock, carried upon rats and fleas. A silent army that obeyed no law and respected no plea. The city, confident in its walls and its commerce, had no notion of the horror approaching. And when it arrived, it moved with patient, merciless rhythm, touching all life in its path. It began with the workers of the port, men and women whose bodies were the first to betray them. Fever seized them with cruel precision, swelling and darkening the skin, racking their frames with convulsions and chills. The cries of the sick carried across the quays and into narrow alleys, where neighbors peered through shutters at the unfolding terror. Yet few realized the scale of the danger until entire families were claimed, households emptied, and the streets became rivers of panic and despair. Churches, once houses of sanctuary, became holding places for the fevered, their altars crowded with bodies and the scent of incense overwhelmed by the stench of death. The city's authorities tried to respond, but the plague obeyed no command. Quarantines were enforced, gates closed, and infected ships set adrift. Yet the disease leaped from street to courtyard, indifferent to barriers or ritual. Chroniclers of the time describe entire neighborhoods vanishing, while some streets remained untouched. As if the city itself were divided by fate's capricious hand, merchants abandoned stalls, artisans fled their workshops, and priests moved from house to house, muttering prayers over the dying, their voices trembling against the roar of silence. The human toll was immense, yet the psychological weight was equally profound. Fear became a palpable companion, a shadow in the corners, a cold whisper in the wind. Survivors told of neighbors dancing between life and death, of bodies left unburied in sun-scorched courtyards, of nights when the city seemed alive only with the groans of the fevered and the tolling of church bells. Rumors flourished, divine punishment, curses, invisible spirits riding the breeze from distant lands. The minds of the living were as fractured as the bodies of the dead. Months passed, and the plague receded as mysteriously as it had arrived. Marseilles, though devastated, endured. Life returned to the bustling quays, the markets, and the sunlit plazas. Yet memory remained. The city carried the echo of 1720 in every alleyway, in the shadow of every arch, in the hush of its courtyards at night. The epidemic had claimed not only flesh, but certainty and security, leaving behind a city forever aware of its own fragility. Walking along the modern harbor, one might imagine the ghosts of the fever drifting among the merchant ships. The faint cries of families vanished, the shadow of the plague lingering in the salt wind. Marseilles survived, yet it was marked, a testament to the invisible forces that shape history, to the patience of death, and to the enduring truth that even the most vibrant and confident cities can be humbled by the quiet, unrelenting hand of a pestilence that moves unseen, leaving memory, shadow, and lesson in its wake. Even now, when the Mediterranean sun glints upon the waves and gulls cry over the quay, the city listens. It listens to the fevered footsteps of 1720, to the whispers of the lost, to the silent echo of mortality threading its canals, streets, and squares, a reminder that no stone, no wall, no harbor can shield life from the relentless rhythm of death. London had barely begun to breathe again when the summer of 1665 returned. With the weight of a shadow to familiar and far too cruel, the streets, once filled with the clatter of carts and the chatter of market folk, had learned the silence of fear. The Thames glimmered in the sunlight, but beneath its surface, the invisible currents carried more than water. They carried whispers of the pestilence that had already claimed tens of thousands. It was a city that had survived, yet in surviving, had become a city of ghosts, walking among the living, eyes wide with the memory of fevered nights and hollowed streets. The plague returned with insidious patience. It crept into crowded tenements, through alleyways lined with timbered homes, and into the grandest of estates, where the wealthy believed themselves immune behind walls of brick and iron. Fever struck, with cruel precision, swelling the skin, cracking it in black and purple, racking the body with convulsions and delirium. Citizens, wary from the first wave, barricaded themselves indoors. Yet the pestilence paid no heed to precaution. Courtyards became cemeteries. Streets ran silent save for the groans of the dying and the tolling of church bells that seemed to measure despair itself. Medical practitioners, desperate and often powerless, moved from house to house, their hands wrapped in cloths and their eyes hollow with fear. Remedies of mercury, vinegar, and fumigated air offered little more than the illusion of protection. Families abandoned loved ones in the hope of survival, only to find themselves facing the same invisible enemy. The city became a theater of horror, servants fleeing noble houses, children wandering empty squares, merchants hiding behind shuttered windows while the aroma of decay wafted through the lanes. And always, the disease moved silently, patient, unhurried, as if the city itself were a canvas and death a brush. Stories multiplied with the fever. Some whispered that the plague was punishment for the sins of the city, a reflection of avarice, pride, and moral decay. Others spoke of rats in the shadows, their tiny claws carrying death on fur and flea alike. But superstition and science were powerless against the relentless logic of the disease. It struck without reason, without mercy, leaving only absence, grief, and the faint hum of despair in its wake. The living learned to move quietly, to speak in whispers, to fear every breath, every touch, every shadow. When winter finally arrived, the plague receded, leaving London hollowed, yet not broken. Tens of thousands lay buried in hastily dug pits. And yet the city endured, cobbled streets once again echoing with life, markets reopening, and the river reflecting the sun like a fragile promise. Yet the city's soul had been indelibly marked. London's memory now carried a rhythm of mortality, a lesson in fragility, a shadowed pulse that reminded all who walked its streets that life is both fleeting and sacred. Even centuries later, wandering the alleys and crossing the Thames bridges, one can feel the echo of that second wave, the faint tapping of fevered footsteps, the silent cries of those left behind, and the shadow of a pestilence that moved with patience, invisibility, and inevitability. The city survived, but it bore the memory of the unseen hand that shapes history and destiny alike, a whisper in the night reminding all who listen that mortality waits, always patiently, threading its rhythm through the heartbeat of humanity. Moscow and St. Petersburg, twin hearts of the Russian Empire, pulsed with life in the years of 1770 to 1772. Yet beneath their grand domes and bustling streets, a shadow gathered, patient and inexorable. Markets overflowed with furs, grain, and imported silks. Bell towers rose proudly against a pale northern sky, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and river water. But an unseen enemy had begun to move through the empire, carried along trade routes, river boats, and dusty roads, an invisible tide of fever and decay that respected neither rank nor station. The first victims appeared quietly, almost unnoticed. Merchants fell in the night. Servants writhed beside the hearth. Children shivered in blankets, their tiny bodies burning with fever. Yet the disease spread with an insidious precision, like frost creeping along a frozen river, touching neighborhoods, noble estates, and peasant villages alike. Physicians arrived with herbs, tinctures, and prayers, but their remedies were no shield. Moscow's grand churches, usually filled with the murmur of devotion, became overcrowded with the fevered, their altars overwhelmed by the presence of the dying. Courtyards, streets, and river banks became burial grounds, hastily filled pits consuming the bodies of those who had not yet been mourned. The plague moved like a dark artist, indiscriminate and patient. Nobles locked themselves within estates, yet the pestilence found them. Families abandoned their homes, only to discover illness lurking in neighboring walls. Chroniclers described a city both alive and hollow, the clamor of markets silenced, the laughter of children extinguished, replaced by the low groans of the fevered and the tolling of church bells marking each new absence. Rumors spread alongside the disease, divine wrath for sins hidden in the hearts of men, spirits rising from the rivers to claim life, or simply the inexorable logic of nature asserting itself over humanity's fragile dominion. Yet, even amidst despair, moments of courage and humanity appeared. Priests and caretakers risked their lives to administer aid, sometimes succumbing themselves. Their devotion a fragile light against the overwhelming darkness. Neighbors tended to one another, quietly, sharing food and warmth where possible, whispering prayers to accompany the dying. The city's collective grief became a presence in itself, palpable in alleys, squares, and across the river. a shadow heavier than stone. By 1772, the plague began to recede, leaving tens of thousands dead, and yet life slowly returned. Markets reopened, bells tolled for festivals rather than funerals, and the rivers reflected the sky once more. But the memory of those years lingered, etched into the walls, streets, and hearts of the citizens. The Russian Empire had survived, yet its soul bore the invisible scar of a pestilence that moved patiently, invisibly, and without mercy. Walking through the historic streets of Moscow or along the canals of St. Petersburg today, one can almost hear the echo of that plague, faint footsteps, soft groans, and whispers of families lost to fever. The city endured, but it remembered, and in that memory lies a haunting truth. Even the mightiest empire, adorned with churches, palaces, and wealth, is never beyond the reach of the unseen hand that threads mortality through the lives of the living, leaving only shadow, silence, and the enduring whisper of history. The fog of London had always carried with it whispers of the unknown, the soft creak of cobblestones, the distant clatter of carriages, and the faint murmur of the Thames. Yet in the winter of 1831, the city felt an unfamiliar chill, one that seeped not from the icy winds, but from a presence invisible to the eye. Cholera had arrived, carried by trade, by crowded tenements, and by the narrow streets where life pressed uncomfortably close to life. The disease moved with a precision that was terrifying and inexorable, threading through the city like a quiet, patient ghost, claiming bodies without ceremony, leaving grief in its wake. It began in the poorer districts, where families huddled in cramped quarters and sanitation was a distant thought. Fever, vomiting, and severe diarrhea struck suddenly, leaving victims weak and hollow-eyed. Mothers watched their children convulse, unable to soothe them, while fathers fell mid-step, grasping for breath that would not come. Physicians, armed with a limited knowledge of the era, offered remedies that ranged from opiates to bleeding, each more futile than the last. The city's hospitals overflowed, makeshift wards filling with the fevered, their cries echoing down darkened corridors and across the river that reflected moonlight. Onto the silent streets, the contagion did not respect social class. Wealthy merchants, tucked safely in townhouses, found servants and children falling ill. Panic spread faster than the disease itself. Families barricaded doors, marketplaces emptied, and streets, once vibrant with the pulse of daily commerce, became corridors of silence and dread. Some turned to superstition, claiming that cholera was divine punishment for moral failings, while others whispered of miasmas rising from the Thames, invisible and deadly. Fear became a tangible presence, pressing against the walls of homes, drifting along alleys, and nestling in every corner where the living huddled and waited. The epidemic advanced with cruel inevitability, peaking in the summer months when the heat made the stench of decay almost unbearable. Entire neighborhoods were depopulated, the abandoned streets echoing with the memory of the fevered cries and the absence of life. Londoners learned to navigate with caution, moving quietly, speaking in hushed tones, avoiding contact whenever possible. But no precaution was sufficient. Death moved silently, unrelenting, patient and invisible, leaving behind despair and the faint, lingering smell of mortality. By the autumn of 1832, the cholera began to recede, leaving tens of thousands dead, and a city hollowed in grief yet determined to endure. Life returned slowly, carriages rattled through the streets, vendors cried their wares, and children once again ran across cobbled alleys. Yet the memory lingered in every shadowed doorway, along the river bank, and in the quiet tolling of church bells. London had survived, but it had been forever altered by the invisible hand of the epidemic, a reminder that mortality moves in rhythms beyond human control, shaping lives, destinies, and the very soul of the city. Even today, when fog drifts along the Thames and the air is tinged with the smell of damp stone, one can imagine the echoes of 1832, faint coughs, hurried footsteps, and the lingering presence of a pestilence that left not just bodies, but the city's spirit scarred. London remembers, quietly, and in its memory is the truth that no wealth, no power, no crowded street can entirely escape the patient, invisible rhythm of life and death intertwined. Ireland, a land of rolling green hills, stone cottages, and mist-laden mornings, carried the quiet rhythm of centuries past. Yet in the years of 1846 to 1849, that rhythm was violently shattered. The potato blight had already stolen sustenance from the poor, turning fields into swaths of rot and hunger, leaving villages hollowed by deprivation. And then came cholera, moving silently along the country lanes and river banks, an invisible predator preying on bodies already weakened by famine. It was not merely disease, but a convergence of despair, hunger, and relentless death, shaping a land and its people in ways the mind struggles to fully comprehend. It began in small villages where families huddled over meager fires, sharing what little food remained. Fever, vomiting, and the agonizing diarrhea of cholera struck suddenly, leaving bodies stiff, eyes sunken, and breath ragged. Children, fragile as springtime saplings, were often the first to succumb, their small hands reaching for warmth and comfort that would not come. Fathers and mothers, already emaciated from hunger, fell in turn, leaving homes abandoned and silent. Neighbors whispered in fear, avoiding the sick, while priests moved from cottage to cottage, carrying prayers and holy water into the heart of darkness. The epidemic spread with terrifying speed, carried along the narrow paths between villages, along rivers where boats ferried goods and bodies alike. Entire communities vanished within weeks. The few who survived wandered like ghosts, the stench of death clinging to clothing and hair, the cries of the fevered echoing in their memories long after the physical groans had ceased. Relief efforts were minimal, for both government and clergy were overwhelmed, and those who might have provided aid were themselves consumed by fear or sickness. Ireland became a land of hushed streets and empty homes, haunted not just by disease, but by the grief of absence. Legends arose from the tragedy. Some spoke of spirits walking the famine-stricken hills, whispering warnings or lamentations. Others believed that dual calamity, hunger and disease, was divine retribution, punishment for sins unseen. Yet in the midst of suffering, courage flickered. Neighbors shared scraps of food, carried the dying to makeshift graves, and whispered prayers for souls passing too soon. Even in despair, humanity persisted, fragile yet undeniable, a flickering light against the oppressive shadow of mortality. By 1849, the worst of the cholera subsided, though the scars remained. Thousands lay buried in unmarked graves, villages had been abandoned, and the population of Ireland had been forever diminished. Yet life persisted. Fields slowly began to yield, the river banks hummed once more with the passage of fishermen, and the hills echoed with the quiet return of footsteps. But the memory of famine and pestilence lingered in every stone cottage, along every misty lane, and in the hearts of those who survived, a silent testament to the relentless, patient, and invisible forces that shape history. Walking the Irish countryside today, one can almost hear the faint echoes of 1846 to 1849, the soft groans of the fevered, the whispers of the famished, and the silent, patient rhythm of death threading through the land. The famine and cholera did not merely take lives, they reshaped a nation, leaving behind memory, grief, and the haunting lesson that survival is both fragile and sacred, always shadowed by the inexorable presence of mortality. The world was changing, the 19th century pulsing with the rhythm of railways, steamships, and cities growing faster than their streets could contain. Yet amidst the progress, an invisible terror circled the globe, patient and unyielding. From India, it spread like a shadow across rivers, ports, and plains, carried along the arteries of trade and human movement. This was the third cholera pandemic, a silent and indiscriminate predator, touching the wealthy and the poor, the scholar and the laborer, leaving behind grief in every land it crossed. It began in the villages along the Ganges, where the river, a giver of life, became an unwitting conduit of death. Men, women, and children succumbed quickly, their bodies racked with cramps, fever, and relentless vomiting. Families buried there, dead with little ceremony, often beside those who had fallen the day before, their grief compressed into swift gestures and whispered prayers. From these villages, the disease traveled west, crossing oceans on crowded ships bound for ports in Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Each arrival brought with it the echo of despair, the familiar groans and fevered cries, a testament to the pandemic's patient reach. In European cities such as London, Hamburg, and Paris, cholera struck with terrifying precision. Markets emptied, inns closed, and the streets were silent except for the tolling of church bells and the occasional cart carrying bodies to hastily dug graves. Physicians were confounded, treatments varied from emetics to bloodletting, but none halted the advance of the invisible killer. Superstition ran rampant alongside science. People whispered that foul air, divine wrath, or moral corruption had summoned the disease. Each explanation insufficient yet desperately clung to. Fear became a tangible presence, thickening the air, shaping every step, every breath, every moment of life. The pandemic did not discriminate. The rich fled their homes, sometimes only to be overtaken by cholera in the crowded streets. The poor were trapped in squalor, their bodies already weakened by hunger or hard labor. Hospitals overflowed, priests administered last rites, and communities learned the cruel logic of inevitability. Anyone could fall. Anyone could vanish without warning. Entire neighborhoods emptied overnight, leaving ghostly streets where only shadows and memory remained. Yet even amidst despair, humanity persisted. Caretakers risked their lives, offering water and comfort to those in the final throes, whispering prayers over the dying. Children were carried to safety when possible. Neighbors shared what little food remained, and the faint glow of compassion flickered through the darkness. Fragile yet undeniable, by 1860, the worst had passed, though tens of thousands had perished, leaving cities and villages scarred by both grief and absence. Today, in ports and streets once ravaged by the third cholera pandemic, one can almost hear the faint echoes of its march, the fevered cries, the hurried footsteps of caretakers, and the silent, patient rhythm of death threading invisibly through life. The world endured, but memory persisted. A haunting reminder that progress does not shield humanity from the patient, invisible hand of mortality, that life is fragile, and that every heartbeat exists alongside forces that shape history, quietly, inevitably, and without mercy. Moscow in the summer of 1771 was a city of golden domes, cobblestone streets, and the steady rhythm of church bells echoing across the Moskva River. Markets overflowed with grain, artisans labored in sunlit courtyards, and the air carried the mingling scents of pine, baked bread, and river mud. Yet beneath this ordinary life, an invisible menace gathered, patient and unrelenting. The plague, carried silently by travelers, merchants, and rats, began its quiet, inexorable march through the city, touching homes and markets, palaces and tenements alike. At first, the signs were subtle: a sudden fever in a market worker, a cough in a servant, swelling that darkened the skin. But soon, the disease revealed its merciless nature. Families watched in horror as one after another succumbed, children writhing in fevered delirium, parents collapsing beside them, neighbors too fearful to intervene. Physicians offered tinctures, prayers, and herbal concoctions, but the invisible hand of death ignored them all. Churches, normally sanctuaries of solace, were soon crowded with the sick, while the rest of the living fled to alleys and courtyards, barricading themselves in homes that had once been warm with family life. The city's response was both frantic and futile. Officials imposed quarantines and attempted to restrict movement, but the plague moved faster than decrees, spreading through neighborhoods with cruel precision. Chroniclers wrote of streets emptied of children, the echoes of groans filling the alleys where laughter had once lived. Mothers abandoned houses in search of safety, only to return to find loved ones claimed. Priests carried the dying to hastily dug mass graves, their prayers swallowed by the oppressive air, their presence barely comforting against the inexorable advance of disease. Legends spread alongside fear. Some whispered that the plague was punishment for sins hidden deep within Moscow's heart. Others spoke of restless spirits riding the night air, spreading fever as they drifted across rooftops. Yet the truth was both simpler and more terrifying: an invisible enemy, patient and impartial, moving along the arteries of a bustling city, indifferent to wealth, status, or devotion. Life became a fragile flame, flickering against the shadow of inevitable loss. By autumn, the worst of the epidemic subsided, leaving tens of thousands dead and a city hollowed in both body and spirit. Streets slowly regained the rhythm of commerce. Church bells rang once more in celebration rather than mourning, and sunlight reflected off the golden domes as if mocking the memory of suffering. Yet Moscow remembered. Its memory was etched into walls, river banks, and narrow alleys, a silent echo of fevered cries and the absence of life. Walking through historic Moscow today, one can almost feel the shadows of 1771, the fevered footsteps, the whispers of the bereaved, the patience of an invisible hand that moved silently through the city. The plague claimed more than flesh. It reshaped the soul of the city, leaving behind memory, grief, and a timeless reminder that mortality threads its way through human history with quiet, unstoppable inevitability. London, a city of mist and soot, of narrow alleys and towering spires, was alive with the pulse of the industrial age. Steam rose from factories. Carriages rattled along cobblestones. and the Thames carried both goods and whispers along its darkened waters. Yet in 1853, an invisible shadow began to thread itself through the city, a shadow that moved silently, unrelenting, carried not by cannon or invader, but by water, filth, and the unseen agents of disease. Cholera had returned. It began quietly, in the lower districts where life pressed close, and the air was heavy with the stench of overcrowding. Children fell suddenly, their small bodies racked with cramping, vomiting, and relentless fever. Adults, weakened by labor and poor nutrition, succumbed in hours, their breaths shallow, their eyes sunken with dread. Families barricaded themselves indoors, only to discover that the invisible enemy was not so easily kept at bay. The city's physicians arrived with remedies that ranged from the plausible to the desperate: opium, bleeding, vinegar, and prayers, but nothing could halt the patient march of the disease. The streets emptied as fear took hold. Markets that once overflowed with produce and cloth were deserted. Vendors huddled behind shuttered stalls. Children no longer ran through narrow alleys, and the ever-present tolling of church bells became the rhythm of daily dread. Entire neighborhoods were depopulated overnight, with bodies carried silently to mass graves or left in quiet courtyards for scavenging birds. Cholera moved with indiscriminate precision, touching the rich and poor alike, sometimes sparing a house for reasons no one could understand, leaving despair and superstition to fill the spaces between survival and death. Rumors and legends flourished amidst the terror. Some claimed divine punishment for moral failings. Others blamed foul air, stagnant water, and the city's own neglect. Mothers whispered prayers over the sleeping bodies of their children, uncertain whether the night would bring relief or grief. Priests offered last rites to the fevered, their voices trembling, while carts carrying the dead rattled through silent streets. The city became a theater of sorrow, every alleyway echoing with the memory of those claimed by the disease, the living moving like shadows among shadows. By the spring of 1854, the epidemic began to fade, leaving thousands dead in a city forever altered. Life slowly returned to London streets. Vendors called their wares once more. Carriages rattled along the cobblestones, and children returned to the squares. Yet the memory of cholera remained, etched into the city's heart, whispered along river banks, lingering in the narrow alleys where life had once been fragile and death had walked so closely. Even today, wandering the banks of the Thames or the winding lanes of old London, one can feel the patient rhythm of mortality from 1853 to 1854, the faint echo of fevered cries, the whispered prayers of the living, and the invisible hand that threads its way through history. Cholera left more than death. It left a reminder that life is fragile, fleeting, and constantly shadowed by the unseen forces that shape destiny, patience, and loss, threading human existence with quiet inevitability. Philadelphia, the young heartbeat of a fledgling nation, hummed with ambition and life. Merchants bustled along the docks. Carriages rattled across sun-warmed cobblestones, and the air carried the scent of river, salt, and fresh baked bread. But in the summer of 1793, the city felt an unfamiliar heaviness, as if the very air had thickened with foreboding. An invisible force had arrived, carried by ships from the Caribbean, whispered along the crowded streets and moving silently into homes, taverns, and markets. This was yellow fever, a predator both unseen and unrelenting, claiming life with fevered precision. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Dockworkers fell first, their bodies succumbing to sudden high fever, vomiting, and jaundiced skin that turned their faces a sickly yellow. Soon, the illness spread through the crowded tenements of the city, leaving families hollowed and terrified. Physicians, armed with limited knowledge and desperation, offered bleeding, purgatives, and herbal concoctions, but the disease defied every remedy. Hospitals became overflowing chambers of grief, the air thick with the cries of the sick and the hushed wails of those left behind. The city descended into fear and chaos. Families abandoned their homes in search of safety, leaving streets silent save for the tolling of church bells and the rattling of carts carrying the dead. Merchants shuttered their shops, children ceased their play, and the wealthy fled to the countryside when possible. Yet no amount of gold or precaution could guarantee survival. The disease moved with cruel, impartial rhythm. It spared no one entirely, yet struck with a capricious hand, leaving behind emptiness, sorrow, and lingering dread. Legends grew from the catastrophe. Some claimed the fever was divine wrath, a warning to a city intoxicated by commerce and ambition. Others whispered of miasmas rising from the river, of invisible spirits riding the humid summer wind, claiming bodies at random amid the fear. Acts of courage and compassion flickered like fragile candlelight. Volunteers carried water, cared for the dying, and offered comfort to those left alone in the silent homes of the afflicted. The pulse of humanity, though faint, endured alongside the relentless hand of mortality. By the autumn, the worst of the outbreak had passed, leaving over 5,000 dead and a city forever changed. Streets gradually filled again, markets reopened, and life resumed its rhythm, yet Philadelphia bore the memory of 1793 in its narrow lanes, river banks, and shuttered homes. Even today, walking along the Delaware or tracing the cobblestones of old quarters, one can feel the ghosted presence of that summer, the fevered steps, the whispered prayers, the shadow of mortality threading through history. Yellow fever claimed. More than bodies, it left a city haunted with memory, grief, and the timeless lesson that life's fragile pulse always walks alongside unseen, unyielding forces of death. India, a land of monsoon rains, sacred rivers, and bustling cities woven with narrow lanes and marketplaces, faced a terror in 1896 that would stretch across more than a decade. The third plague pandemic arrived silently, carried in the dust of crowded streets, in the fur of rats, and in the breath of unsuspecting travelers. Bombay, Pune, and Calcutta cities alive with the sounds of trade, prayer, and human bustle became the stages upon which death moved unseen, methodical, and patient, leaving despair in its wake. It began with the subtle, a fever, a swelling. In the lymph nodes, the pallor of jaundice creeping over skin. Villagers and city dwellers alike fell suddenly, racked by chills and delirium. Families abandoned homes in frantic fear, leaving the streets littered with possessions, pets, and sometimes even bodies too weak to be moved. Physicians and colonial officials scrambled to respond, but the scale was overwhelming. Makeshift hospitals overflowed, and quarantine measures were enforced with rigid authority. Yet the disease leapt from house to house, neighborhood to neighborhood. With the relentless patience of a shadow that refuses to be chased away, the social fabric itself began to fray. Markets emptied, the clatter of carts ceased, and priests performed rituals over the dying, sometimes themselves succumbing to the fever. Legends mingled with terror, whispers that the plague was divine punishment, curses carried by trade ships, or the restless spirits of the city exacting vengeance. Entire communities vanished overnight, leaving streets haunted with the silence of absence. Children wandered in confusion, mothers grieved silently, and the elderly whispered prayers into empty courtyards. The air itself seemed heavy with despair, a tangible presence pressing on the living as surely as it pressed upon the dying. Yet even in darkness, flickers of humanity persisted. Volunteers carried water, food, and comfort to the afflicted, risking their own lives in quiet defiance of mortality. Families, despite fear, tended to one another, whispering prayers and murmuring hope into the night. The plague, patient and impartial, respected no wealth, no caste, no power. But the faint glow of compassion flickered in pockets across the cities and villages of India. Fragile yet undeniable, by 1910, the worst of the pandemic had receded, leaving behind millions dead, cities scarred, and generations transformed by grief and survival. Yet memory endured. In Bombay's narrow lanes, in Calcutta's river fronts, and in the whispers of villages across the subcontinent, the shadow of the plague lingered, a quiet echo of fevered cries, abandoned homes, and the patient, invisible hand of mortality. India has survived, but the third plague pandemic left a timeless lesson etched in streets, stones, and hearts. Life is fragile, unseen forces shape destiny, and memory of loss is as enduring as the rivers themselves. The world had barely exhaled after the roar of guns had ceased and the smoke of war had lifted, when an invisible enemy began its relentless march. The year was 1918. And across continents and oceans, from the trenches of Europe to the crowded ports of America and the villages of Asia, a fever moved with astonishing speed. It was influenza, unlike any the world had seen. A whisper at first, then a roar, carrying with it death in the very breath of those it touched. The Spanish flu did not distinguish between soldier and civilian, rich or poor. It claimed life, with a terrifying impartiality, threading invisibly through a world already trembling from loss. In city streets and rural lanes alike, it began subtly. Coughs, chills, and fevered trembling signaled the arrival of a pestilence that would transform daily life into a fragile, suspenseful dance with mortality. Families barricaded themselves in their homes, terrified to breathe the air of the street. Hospitals overflowed, their wards crowded with those who gasped for breath. Their eyes wild with panic and delirium, physicians, exhausted by war and despair, had few tools to offer, and remedies ranged from the traditional to the desperate quinine. Herbal concoctions, isolation none capable of halting the invisible tide. The disease spread with unprecedented speed. Trains carried it across nations. Returning soldiers brought it from the front lines. Ships delivered it across oceans. Markets emptied, schools closed, and the rhythm of daily life fractured. Even the young, usually spared the worst of influenza, fell in droves, leaving towns and cities hollowed. Bells tolled incessantly over the silent streets, marking deaths that were both sudden and unrelenting. Fear became a constant companion, whispering in corners, pressing against walls, and threading itself into the very air that citizens inhaled. Stories emerged amidst the horror. Some claimed the virus was a punishment for humanity's hubris. Others whispered of contagion born from the machinery of modern warfare. Yet even in despair, acts of courage persisted. Neighbors tended to one another. Nurses and volunteers risked infection to carry water and medicine. As families whispered prayers to accompany the dying, life persisted in fragments, flickering, like fragile candlelight against the overwhelming darkness of loss. By the autumn of 1919, the worst of the pandemic had passed, leaving an estimated 50 million dead worldwide. Cities slowly regained their rhythm. Markets reopened, trains resumed, and laughter returned, though it was muted, tempered by memory. Yet the ghost of the Spanish flu lingered in every street, every lane, and every quiet home. Its memory, like an invisible river, flowed through history, a reminder that humanity, despite all progress, is fragile, constantly shadowed by unseen forces that move with quiet, unstoppable inevitability. The world survived, but it bore the scars, etched into the fabric of life, whispered in the wind, and felt in the collective pulse of memory, where the invisible hand of mortality waits, patient, unyielding, and eternal. The world believed it, had learned how to listen to disease. Antibiotics had tempered old fears. Cities had risen taller and cleaner, and medicine spoke with the quiet confidence of progress. Yet in the spring of 1957, a new whisper began to move across the globe, soft at first, almost polite. It came from the east, carried on breath and motion. On trains and ships and crowded classrooms, by the time it was given a name, it had already crossed borders without leaving footprints. The Asian flu arrived not as a scream, but as a murmur that grew impossible to ignore. In Hong Kong and mainland China, fever spread through schools and factories with a strange speed. Children returned home pale and trembling. Workers collapsed mid-shift, their bodies suddenly heavy, lungs burning as if filled with ash. The illness felt familiar, almost ordinary headache, chills, coughing, but it moved faster than memory allowed. Within weeks, the sickness traveled outward, following the veins of a connected world. Planes carried it across oceans. Soldiers brought it to barracks. Students carried it into lecture halls where silence replaced debate. Cities across Europe and the Americas felt the shift almost overnight. Hospitals filled with patients struggling to breathe, their faces flushed, eyes unfocused, voices reduced to whispers. Entire households fell ill together, parents and children lying side by side, counting hours through fever dreams. Doctors worked tirelessly, offering what relief they could, yet there was a quiet unease in their movements. This was not the plague of old stone cities, nor the cholera of foul water. This was something lighter, faster, almost ghost-like, an illness that moved with modern life itself. Death came less dramatically than in centuries past, but no less persistently. Elderly bodies surrendered first, then the very young. Rural villages mourned in quiet clusters. Urban neighborhoods felt the loss in absences, empty desks, unlit windows, unanswered telephones. Bells still rang, though fewer noticed how often. Grief unfolded not in spectacle, but in repetition, day after day, name after name. The flu did not demand attention, it simply endured. By 1958, the fever receded, leaving millions dead across the world. Life resumed its rhythm with unsettling speed. Trains ran, schools reopened, conversations shifted forward, yet something lingered beneath the surface. An unspoken recognition that even in an age of science and speed, the invisible could still outrun certainty. In quiet rooms where old photographs rest and memory softens its edges, the Asian flu remains a reminder that disease does not always arrive as catastrophe. Sometimes it comes softly, moving with the breath of the everyday, teaching humanity that fragility does not vanish with progress. It simply learns new ways to travel. The world was moving faster now. Neon lights flickered in cities that never slept, radios hummed with voices from far away, and jet engines stitched continents together in hours rather than weeks. Humanity believed it had mastered distance, mastered speed, mastered the old fears that once crept slowly through medieval streets. And yet, in the summer of 1968, a quiet disturbance rose in the dense neighborhoods of Hong Kong, where humid air clung to skin and life unfolded in tight, breathing crowds. It began as so many plagues do, not with panic, but with fatigue. Workers felt an unfamiliar heaviness settle into their limbs. Children returned from school flushed and trembling, their laughter replaced by coughing that lingered long into the night. Fever followed swiftly, then weakness, then the strange sensation of breath slipping just out of reach. It was influenza again, familiar. Anemia suddenly transformed, wearing a new face that the body did not recognize. By the time physicians began to understand its difference, the virus had already slipped beyond the harbor, beyond the city, beyond the continent. Airplanes carried it silently, sealed in cabins where recycled breath passed from stranger to stranger. Soldiers transported it between bases. Tourists carried it home as an uninvited souvenir. Within months, the Hong Kong flu circled the globe, leaving a trail of illness that moved faster than fear could organize itself. Hospitals filled not with spectacle, but with quiet urgency. Beds lined hallways. Nurses moved with practiced exhaustion. Doctors spoke in measured tones that concealed uncertainty beneath routine. Unlike the great plagues of stone and fire, this pandemic unfolded without the collapse of cities. Markets remained open, streets stayed lit, life continued even as. And then, death arrived quietly, often in the night. The elderly were most vulnerable, their lungs surrendering to inflammation and exhaustion. Those already weakened by illness faded first, their absence noticed only in the sudden stillness of familiar places, a chair left empty, a voice no longer answering the telephone. There were no mass graves, no burning pyres, no visible end to the world, and yet grief accumulated like dust. Families mourned privately. Communities absorbed loss without ceremony. Newspapers printed numbers that failed to convey the weight of individual lives. The virus did not terrify in the old way. It eroded instead, teaching a subtler lesson that devastation does not always announce itself with drama. Sometimes it arrives in repetition, in ordinary days that quietly become the last. Scientists worked swiftly, developing vaccines that arrived in waves, unevenly distributed across nations. Some were protected, others waited. In poorer regions, the flu lingered longer, threading through villages and cities where medical access was scarce. The world was connected, but not equally guarded. The virus exposed this truth with cold clarity, moving wherever breath and movement allowed. By 1970, the Hong Kong flu had loosened its grip, leaving an estimated 1 to 4 million dead. The world exhaled and moved on. Music grew louder, cities expanded, memory softened. Yet beneath the surface of progress, something remained unsettled. The pandemic had proven that speed itself could be a weakness, that connection could become a corridor for unseen forces older than civilization itself. Even now, in the hum of airports and the quiet press of crowded trains, the echo of 1968 lingers, a reminder that disease does not belong to the past. It adapts, it listens, it waits. And when humanity forgets its vulnerability, it returns not as judgment, not as malice, but as a quiet correction carried on the breath of the living, whispering that no era is immune to the ancient rhythm of life and loss. At first, it did not feel like a plague. There were no bells, no barricaded streets, no sudden collapse of cities. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly, in hospital rooms where doctors stared at charts that refused to make sense. Young bodies, once strong, began to fail. Lungs filled with infections that should not have been fatal. Skin bloomed with dark lesions like bruises from an unseen hand. In 1981, the world sensed a disturbance but did not yet recognize it as the beginning of one of the most profound and lingering pandemics in human history. The disease had no single place of origin that the world could agree upon, only a widening circle of absence. Patients wasted away slowly, their strength dissolving over months and years, rather than days. Fear followed close behind, but it was a different kind of fear, one tangled with misunderstanding, stigma, and silence. Families whispered, governments hesitated, communities were fractured not only by illness, but by judgment and denial. The virus did not move through breath or water. It traveled through blood, through intimacy, through trust itself. Hospitals became places of quiet vigil. Nurses learned to touch without flinching. Friends sat at bedsides long after others had turned away. In some cities, entire neighborhoods seemed to dim, their brightest voices fading one by one. Funerals became frequent, then routine, then unbearably ordinary. Names accumulated faster than memory could hold them. And still, the virus remained unseen, unacknowledged by many who believed distance or morality could protect them. What made this plague different was its duration. It did not burn through and vanish. It lingered. Years passed, then decades. Children grew up knowing its name. Entire generations learned to live with its shadow. In parts of the world, particularly in Africa, the disease tore through communities with devastating force, leaving millions of children without parents and societies bent beneath prolonged grief. Progress came slowly, treatments that extended life, knowledge that replaced fear, but never evenly, never universally, yet within the darkness. Something rare took shape. Activism rose where silence once ruled. Care networks formed where abandonment had been common. Love persisted in hospital rooms, in marches, in whispered promises made to the dying. The pandemic reshaped medicine, ethics, and the language of compassion itself. It taught the world that a plague could be social as well as biological, that suffering could be compounded by neglect, and that survival often depended as much on dignity as on science. Today, the HIV/AIDS pandemic has not ended. It has simply grown quieter, woven into daily life. Managed rather than conquered, millions still live with it. Millions more have been lost. And in that long, unfinished story lies a sobering truth. Some plagues do not arrive like storms. They arrive like shadows at dusk, slow, persistent, and transformative. They change not only bodies, but how humanity learns to see one another in the face of fear, intimacy, and enduring loss. It began in winter, when breath hangs visibly in the air and cities retreat inward. In the southern provinces of China, doctors noticed something unsettling: a pneumonia that did not behave as it should. Patients arrived gasping, lungs clouded, as if fog had settled inside the body itself. Fevers climbed sharply, refusing to break. Caregivers fell ill beside those they treated, and in hospital corridors meant for healing, fear began to walk quietly, learning the layout of every ward. This illness had no patience for distance. It moved through touch, through breath, through the smallest moments of closeness. One cough in a crowded room was enough. One night in a hospital bed could become a turning point between life and absence. Severe acute respiratory syndrome (SARS) was given its name only after it had already begun to travel, and once it learned the pathways of the modern world, it followed them without hesitation. Airports became thresholds of unease. Travelers carried more than luggage. They carried the invisible weight of contagion. From Hong Kong, the disease leapt outward to Singapore, to Toronto, to distant cities bound together by flight paths and trust. Hotels, hospitals, and apartment towers became sites of sudden silence, their rooms sealed, their doors marked by warning rather than welcome. Entire floors were emptied. Elevators stood still. The ordinary machinery of daily life faltered under the pressure of uncertainty. Hospitals became the heart of the storm. Doctors and nurses worked behind masks and shields, their faces hidden, their voices muffled, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. Many would fall ill themselves. Some would not return home. There were no crowds in the streets, no public spectacle of collapse. Instead, there was isolation rooms sealed tight, patients cut off from loved ones, final words spoken through glass or not at all. Death came quietly, clinically, often alone. Fear traveled faster than the virus. Cities emptied not from decree, but from instinct. Markets closed, schools fell silent. Public spaces echoed with absence. In some places, entire neighborhoods withdrew into themselves, counting days by news updates and rumors, unsure whether the next breath would be safe. The disease was not widespread compared to ancient plagues, but its psychological weight was immense. It reminded the world how fragile control truly was, how quickly confidence could unravel. Yet unlike many plagues before it, SARS was confronted with a rare unity. Borders closed, quarantines were enforced. Information, imperfect but urgent, moved between nations. Scientists worked through nights without sleep, tracing patterns, isolating causes, learning the shape of the enemy as it moved. Each recovered patient became a quiet victory. Each halted chain of transmission felt like holding back a rising tide with bare hands, and somehow succeeding. By 2004, the fever receded. Just over 8,000 had been infected. Fewer than 1,000 had died. In the ledger of history, the number seemed small, but the impact lingered far beyond statistics. SARS had exposed the vulnerability of a connected world. It had revealed how swiftly fear could spread, how essential trust and cooperation were, and how thin the line was between order and silence. In hospitals that once echoed with alarms, calm returned. Airports resumed their restless hum. Masks disappeared from faces, and yet something remained unsettled. The world had glimpsed a future shaped by invisible threats that moved at the speed of breath and metal wings. It had felt the chill of isolation, the ache of separation, the cost of delay. SARS did not reshape history through sheer scale. It reshaped it through warning, a quiet rehearsal written in fever and quarantine, teaching humanity that the age of plagues had not ended. It had simply learned to travel faster, to hide better, and to wait for moments when the world believed itself safe. The cold arrived. Before the sickness, it came sweeping down from the Siberian plains, carrying with it a wind so sharp it seemed to cut through bone and memory alike. In Manchuria, where the earth freezes solid and breath turns to smoke, winter had always been a familiar enemy. But in the final years of the Qing dynasty, another force joined the cold, silent, unseen, and far more merciless. At first, it was only whispers along the railways, a hunter collapses in his lodging, a laborer coughs blood onto the snow, a body found stiff before morning, eyes open, mouth darkened by something no prayer could undo. The sickness moved faster than rumors, faster than understanding. One day a man was alive, wrapped in fur against the frost. The next, he was frozen in death, lungs filled with shadow. This was pneumonic plague, rarer than its bubonic cousin, but infinitely crueler. It did not require fleas or rats. It needed only breath, but words spoken too closely, a shared room, a final exhale. Manchuria was not ready. The region was a crossroads of empire and ambition. Russian and Japanese railways cut through ancient land like scars that refused to heal. Cities swelled with migrants, traders, soldiers, and hunters drawn by the promise of work and the wealth of the tar-baking marmot, whose fur fetched high prices in distant markets. These animals, warm-blooded and unsuspecting, carried death quietly in their bodies. Those who hunted them did not know they were opening a door that should have remained sealed. By the time officials realized something was terribly wrong, the plague had already learned the rhythm of the land. It moved along rail lines and frozen roads, passing from town to town like a curse spoken in many tongues. Entire households vanished within days, bodies piled in makeshift morgues, stacked like firewood against the cold. There were not enough coffins. There was not enough ground that could be dug through frozen soil. Fear turned neighbor against neighbor. Families barred doors. Trains were abandoned mid-route, passengers fleeing into the snow rather than risk sharing air with the sick. The sound of coughing became a sentence. To hear it was to step closer to the grave. And yet, in the heart of this unfolding nightmare, a quiet figure emerged, one not armed with sword or decree, but with knowledge and resolve. Wu Linte was young, foreign-born, and underestimated. A doctor trained in the West, he was summoned to confront what many still believed was a seasonal illness or a divine punishment. He arrived to find chaos, bodies unexamined, customs clashing with science, and death moving faster than tradition could contain. Wu listened to the dead. He studied their lungs, darkened and destroyed. He noted the speed of transmission, the way entire groups fell within days. And he spoke a truth that many resisted, that this plague traveled through the air itself, that burial practices, open coffins, and crowded homes were feeding the sickness, that unless drastic measures were taken, Manchuria would become a vast cemetery by spring. His words were not welcomed. Tradition does not surrender easily, especially when grief clings to ritual like a final comfort. But the plague did not care for customs. It respected only distance, silence, and breath withheld. Under Wu's guidance, unprecedented actions followed. Cities were sealed. Travel was restricted. The dead were cremated, an act once unthinkable, now unavoidable. Masks were designed and worn, layers of cloth standing between life and death. They were crude by modern standards, but they mattered. For the first time, humanity attempted to intercept a plague at the level of the air itself. Winter deepened. The wind howled through empty streets. Fires burned day and night to consume the dead, their smoke rising into a sky that offered no answers. The living moved like ghosts, faces hidden, voices lowered, afraid even of their own breath. And then, slowly, the tide began to turn. New cases declined. Entire towns, once silent with death, began to stir again. The plague, robbed of closeness and warmth, retreated back into the cold from which it had emerged. By the time the snow began to melt, over 60,000 were dead, but millions more were alive because someone had dared to listen to science. When fear demanded denial, the Manchurian plague did not echo through history like the Black Death. It did not rewrite continents or shatter empires overnight, but it marked a threshold, a moment when humanity stood face to face with airborne annihilation and chose discipline over despair. Yet even in victory, the silence lingered. The railways resumed their schedules, markets reopened, the masks were folded away, but beneath the routines of life, a lesson remained, etched into memory like frostbite scars. The world had learned that plagues need not crawl, they could fly. That borders drawn on maps meant nothing to the air we share. That survival, sometimes, depends on how quickly we are willing to change who we are. In Manchuria, the snow eventually covered the places where bodies once lay. Wind erased footprints. Time softened the horror. But the cold remembers. The air remembers. And when the world forgets that it once learned how to listen to silence, the wind begins to carry whispers again, waiting for crowded rooms, unguarded breaths, and the fragile illusion that such nights can never return. Deep in the heart of equatorial Africa, where the rainforest rises like a green cathedral and the rivers wind like veins of life, an invisible terror emerged in 1976. Zaire, known today as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, was a land alive with birdsong, drumbeats, and the quiet rhythm of village life. But that year, a sickness arrived that did not respect rhythm, song, or the familiar cadence of life. It was Ebola, a virus that would claim the body before the mind could comprehend the scale of its cruelty. It began with fever, chills, and weakness that left limbs too heavy to lift. Villagers whispered of a darkness that crept from home to home. Farmers fell while tending cassava fields. Children never returned from play. The sick vomited and bled, their bodies racked by a force no healer could command. Physicians, few and poorly equipped, struggled in makeshift clinics, their hands bound by fear and lack of knowledge. There were no treatments, no antidotes, no prayers that could reverse the invisible tide. Rumors spread faster than the disease itself. Some claimed that the virus was a punishment from the forest spirits. Others whispered that foreign scientists had brought death to the villages. Cloaked in kindness and curiosity, trust eroded like soil in a torrential rain. Families barricaded homes. Neighbors turned away the suffering, and fear became a language more widely spoken than any local tongue. Even the act of compassion carried risk. One touch, one breath too close, and life could be extinguished. Hospitals filled with the dying, and the dead multiplied faster than they could be buried. Coffins were scarce. The forest itself became a silent graveyard, swallowing bodies with neither ceremony nor song. The disease did not pause for grief. It ripped through communities, sparing no one entirely, leaving the living to wander empty houses, haunted by echoes of voices that would never return. Amid the terror, small acts of humanity flickered like fragile lanterns. Local nurses, foreign doctors, and villagers themselves risked everything to care for the sick, marking a quiet resistance against death. Isolation protocols were improvised, makeshift protective clothing fashioned from whatever could be found. Even in the shadow of relentless mortality, courage took root, stubborn and small. By the end of 1976, the outbreak had claimed over 280 lives, leaving villages scarred and communities wary of strangers and whispers alike. Yet the virus remained, a latent threat lurking in forests and rivers, waiting decades later to return. In new outbreaks, the lesson was stark. Some plagues do not announce themselves like storms. They creep through shadows, forests, and human networks, testing the limits of vigilance and compassion. Even now, walking along the rivers of the Congo, or tracing the paths of villages long abandoned, one can feel the weight of that year. The rainforest hums as it always has, but beneath the birdsong, beneath the rustle of leaves, the memory of Ebola lingers, an unseen hand reminding humanity of its fragility, the quiet power of nature, and the fragile pulse of life when confronted with forces older and stranger than history itself. London was a city of fog and soot. its river a ribbon of shadows reflecting gas lamps and the hurried lives of millions. The summer of 1866 was unusually warm, and with the heat came a subtle menace that would soon transform the bustling metropolis into a theater of fear. Cholera returned to the city, the invisible scourge that had haunted the streets for decades. Bringing with it fever, vomiting, and the dark stain of death, it began in the crowded districts near the Thames. Warehouses pressed close together, and sanitation was still a dream half realized. Families awoke to find children weak, limbs trembling, skin pale and clammy. Adults soon followed, their breaths shallow, their bodies convulsing in rhythm with a disease that respected neither wealth nor station. Hospitals filled quickly, wards overflowing, corridors crowded with the sick and dying, nurses moving with practiced exhaustion, doctors whispering remedies that could do little against the relentless tide. The streets changed as fear took hold, marketplaces emptied, the laughter of children vanished, and the rattle of carts carrying goods gave way to the creak of wagons transporting the dead. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the river itself was cursed, others blamed miasmas, the foul air rising from decaying refuse. And yet, the disease did not rely on superstition. It moved methodically, striking the unsuspecting in their homes, in their workplaces. Along streets no one dared to traverse at night. Entire neighborhoods experienced near silence. Doors remained shut, windows closed, families isolated, the living haunted by the knowledge that a single moment of carelessness could summon death to their threshold. The Thames, once the lifeblood of the city, became a reminder of human vulnerability, its waters carrying not just commerce, but the ghosts of those lost, unseen yet deeply remembered. In the midst of despair, courage emerged. Volunteers delivered water and food, often at the cost of their own safety. Doctors experimented with purification methods, mapping the disease, tracing its deadly flow. Some houses were quarantined, entire streets sealed, in desperate attempts to halt the invisible advance, and gradually, measures that once seemed intrusive or impossible began to contain the tide. By autumn, the outbreak had subsided, leaving over 5,000 dead, countless others weakened, and a city forever altered. London's pulse returned to the streets, markets reopened, and children's laughter slowly re-emerged. Yet beneath the hum of everyday life, memory persisted. The ghost of cholera lingered in narrow alleys, in the banks of the Thames, and in the unspoken knowledge of the living that civilization is fragile, that death can move quietly through the ordinary, and that vigilance is the eternal companion of survival. Even today, wandering the foggy lanes of Victorian London or along the river's edge, one can feel the echo of 1866, the soft, insistent reminder that disease does not always arrive with drumbeats or fire. Sometimes it arrives as silence, as caution, as shadows threading through the rhythm of life itself. Marseille was a city of sun and salt, its harbor alive with the clamor of sailors, merchants, and travelers from every corner of the Mediterranean. Ships docked, their sails still wet from the sea, carrying goods and news from distant lands. But among the barrels of spices, silk, and wine, one vessel carried an unseen stowaway, a dark seed of death that would soon cast a shadow over the entire city. It began quietly. A few sailors fell ill, their limbs weakened by fever, their skin blotched with spots that seemed to bloom from within. Families whispered of a curse, of divine punishment for sins unknown. The wealthy sought refuge in their villas, the poor crowded into narrow streets, unaware of the invisible danger moving among them. Within weeks, the illness bubonic plague spread. With terrifying precision, jumping from dock to home, from market to alley, from mother to child, hospitals were soon overwhelmed. The sick lay side by side, gasping, delirious, their bodies swollen with buboes that oozed death. Priests moved among the dying, chanting prayers into ears that could barely hear. Streets emptied as fear deepened, carts transporting the dead clattering through silent squares, leaving a trail of grief and disbelief. In some homes, entire families succumbed, leaving doors closed and windows dark, the echoes of life extinguished within. Authorities attempted to intervene. Quarantines were enforced, ships held at anchor, and infected neighborhoods sealed behind walls of timber and stone. But the plague did not negotiate. It crept through shadows, moved with whispers, and thrived wherever fear and desperation allowed it. For over 18 months, Marseille was transformed into a city of sorrow, its laughter replaced by wailing, its markets abandoned, its harbor a place of silent mourning. Yet amid despair, courage flickered, volunteers carried water and care. To the sick, Clergy tended to the dying without retreat, and some families found the strength to shield one another, even as neighbors vanished. The city's spirit, though battered, clung stubbornly to life. Slowly, the tide began to recede. By 1722, the outbreak had claimed tens of thousands of lives, yet Marseille endured, scarred but not broken. Today, wandering the sun-drenched streets of Marseille, one can almost hear the faint echoes of 1720, the ghosted footsteps along the quay, the soft toll of distant bells, the shadowed presence of fear mingled with hope. The Great Plague left, more than death. It left a lesson etched into the city's very stones, that even in the face of unstoppable disease, human resilience persists, quiet and enduring, like a candle, flickering in a window against the darkness of night. The world had grown smaller. Stitched together by railways, telegraphs, and steamships, ideas traveled faster, goods moved farther, and the rhythm of life quickened with every train whistle and telegraph click. And yet, in the winter of 1889, an invisible visitor began its journey across this increasingly connected world, a whisper of illness that would claim millions. It was called the Russian flu, and it moved not with the thunder of medieval plague, but with the subtle inevitability of a shadow passing over the land. St. Petersburg was its cradle, the cold city, with streets glazed in frost and canals reflecting the pale winter sun, became the first stage of an epidemic that would soon circle the globe. Citizens awoke with chills, fevers, and fatigue that seemed disproportionate to the world they knew. Within days, coughs echoed down narrow lanes, workshops emptied, and hospitals began to fill with patients who arrived weak and bewildered. Unsure whether the illness would end in days or lifetimes, railways carried the disease across the empire, through Moscow and Kiev, onward to Europe. Steamships bore it across oceans to North America. In an age of industrial expansion and migration, human movement itself became a conduit for death. Invisible yet relentless, the virus struck quickly, often overwhelming the body before the mind could comprehend its progression. Those affected described a peculiar exhaustion, a feeling of weight pressing into every limb, as if gravity had been suddenly intensified by sickness. Communities faltered, markets and schools fell silent. Families kept their distance, fearing the invisible thread that could bring disease into their homes. The wealthy retreated to country estates, the poor huddled in crowded tenements, both equally vulnerable to the virus that paid no heed to status. Physicians worked tirelessly, documenting symptoms, attempting treatments, and sending warnings. But the illness respected no authority, no borders, no human pride. Within months, the Russian flu had spread across Europe, Africa, and the Americas, leaving a trail of suffering measured not just in death, but in exhaustion, fear, and the temporary collapse of daily life. Unlike ancient plagues, it did not leave cities in ruins or graves stacked high in public squares. Its power was quieter, more insidious. It revealed the fragility of modern life, the invisible veins through which illness could travel alongside commerce, conversation, and human ambition. By 1890, the worst had passed. Millions had succumbed, and millions more had recovered, leaving behind a world subtly changed. People returned to work, children returned to school, and trains resumed their steady rhythm. Yet the memory lingered, a reminder that even in an age of progress and speed, humanity could still be shadowed by invisible forces. The Russian flu became a whisper in the annals of history, a caution that the pulse of life is never fully in human hands, and that unseen enemies, patient and persistent, may always follow the corridors of our cities, the rails of our empires, and the rhythm of our breath. Rome had reached the height of its power, its roads stretching like arteries across the known world, its legions marching with iron discipline, its cities thrumming with life and ambition. And yet, in the middle of the 2nd century, an invisible specter began to weave itself into the very fabric of the empire, plague that would haunt history, not with grand spectacle, but with relentless, quiet attrition. Historians call it the Antonini Plague, and its origins were whispered to lie far to the east, brought back by soldiers returning from campaigns in the lands of the Parthians. It began with fever, chills, and fatigue that left even the strongest soldiers weakened, skin reddened, throats ached, and a cough, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent, heralded the arrival of death. Families in Rome, Antioch, and beyond soon found themselves isolated, watching as the young and old alike fell to a sickness that respected neither rank nor wealth. The empire, proud and invincible in its architecture and armies, discovered suddenly that it was fragile, mortal, and incapable of controlling all that moved through its borders. The plague spread along roads and riverways carried by merchants, soldiers, and travelers who scarcely knew they were infected. Cities that once boasted the triumph of marble temples and bustling markets became silent in parts, shops closed, and civic gatherings were abandoned as fear and fatigue took root. The sick were often left at home, cared for as best they could be, or abandoned when hope had fled. Physicians struggled with remedies that were primitive at best: herbs, bloodletting, and prayers, none capable of halting the tide. Death came not as a roar, but as an insistent, unrelenting whisper. Families mourned daily. Entire cohorts of soldiers vanished from campaigns. Provinces felt the strain as trade slowed and the legions weakened. It is said that Marcus Aurelius himself, the philosopher king, watched the plague claim his people and ultimately took it into his own body, dying as both leader and witness to the vulnerability of human life. By the end of his 17-year sweep, the Antonini plague had claimed millions, reshaping the empire in ways unseen in the architectural monuments or political decrees. Population fell, economies faltered, fear became a quiet companion to those who survived, and the memory of suffering settled into the stories passed through generations. Even centuries later, when Rome was dust and echoes of its power remained only in stone and memory, the plague whispered its lesson that no empire, no matter how vast, can escape the quiet inevitability of mortality. That disease, patient and impartial, flows through the veins of civilization, reminding the living that even in triumph, they remain subject to forces older than law, older than conquest, and older than history itself. The Mediterranean shimmered beneath the sun, a cradle of commerce, faith, and ambition. Byzantium, the great city astride continents, rose like a jewel at the edge of the known world, its walls vast, its markets teeming, its churches echoing with prayers and incense. And yet, in 541 CE, a shadow crossed the shimmering waters, invisible and uninvited, carrying with it a horror that would haunt humanity for centuries: the plague of Justinian. It arrived quietly, hidden in the dust and fleas that traveled aboard ships from distant ports. Merchants did not recognize it. Sailors did not see it. Yet the city itself seemed to shiver with anticipation. Soon, the first signs appeared: fever, chills, swelling in the groin and armpits, blackened skin marking the journey of death from within. Families watched in disbelief as breadwinners, mothers, children, and emperors alike fell, one after another, to an enemy they could not confront with swords or walls. Constantinople, proud and impregnable in its stone and strategy, became a city of shadows. Streets that once rang with the cadence of life became silent, save for the groans of the sick. Markets emptied as merchants abandoned stalls. Fearing the invisible contagion, the harbor, lifeblood of trade, became a corridor of despair. As ships brought more than spices and silk, they brought disease, carried unseen across the waves. The plague moved with cruel indifference, sparing neither the powerful nor the poor. Emperor Justinian himself was stricken, confined to his chambers while the pulse of the empire faltered. Generals could not command armies, officials could not enforce laws, and prayers poured from churches in endless rivers. Yet the divine seemed silent before the relentless tide. In some districts, bodies lay unburied in streets and courtyards, turning homes into chambers of sorrow, turning the familiar into corridors of grief. Estimates suggest that the plague claimed millions across the empire, weakening Byzantine power and altering the course of history. Trade slowed, armies faltered, and entire cities were depopulated. And yet, the disease eventually receded, leaving survivors to rebuild amidst the echoes of absence, the memory of silent homes, and the haunting knowledge that the world could change overnight through forces unseen. Even now, walking through the ruins of Constantinople, tracing the walls that survived siege after siege, one can sense the shadow of the plague of Justinian lingering, a reminder that human ambition, no matter how grand, exists always in delicate balance with invisible forces. That empires may rise on stone and will, but life, fragile and fleeting, is always at the mercy of the unseen currents that flow alongside it. The world was in motion. Steamships cut through oceans, railways stitched continents together, and cities swelled with the energy of industrial ambition. Yet, amid this progress, a shadow moved silently along the arteries of human activity, a ghost carried in water and sweat. In the very essence of life itself, the third cholera pandemic had begun, and it would become the deadliest wave of a disease that had haunted humanity for generations. It began in the fertile plains of India, Along the banks of the Ganges, where villages bustled with trade, devotion, and the rhythms of daily life, farmers rose with the sun, pilgrims journeyed to sacred waters, and children played beside canals that glimmered in morning light. But the waters carried more than life. They carried Vibrio cholerae, a bacterium invisible to the eye, yet cruel, and precise in its execution. Fever, vomiting, and the relentless diarrhea struck swiftly, leaving the body hollowed and fragile within hours. Families watched helplessly as fathers, mothers, and children faded, the sounds of life replaced by a quiet, nigh despair. From India, the disease traveled along trade routes, climbing aboard steamships bound for Europe, Russia, and the Americas. Port cities became the front lines of an invisible war. London, Paris, St. Petersburg, and New York saw their poorest quarters emptied or quarantined. The sick carried to hospitals ill-equipped to contain the tide. Bodies piled in hastily dug graves, streets became channels of fear, and even the most bustling marketplaces felt the hush of absence, broken only by the cries of those who had lost everything to the waterborne scourge. Authorities implemented quarantines, tried to purify wells, and attempted rudimentary filtration. Yet the pandemic moved faster than policy or hope. People fled cities, spreading the disease further as panic became a vehicle as potent as the bacterium itself. Rumors of curses, divine punishment, or poison circulated, entwining superstition with the harsh facts of infection. Communities fractured, and the social fabric strained under the weight of relentless mortality. Estimates suggest over 1 million deaths occurred during these 8 years, reshaping populations, economies, and collective consciousness. But within the horror, new knowledge emerged, the understanding that cholera traveled through water, that sanitation mattered, that disease could be interrupted through human intervention. Slowly, painfully, humanity learned how to guard itself against the invisible. Even as the lessons were imperfectly applied across continents, even today, walking beside the canals of Kolkata or the Thames in London, one can feel echoes of the third cholera pandemic. Water moving quietly, carrying memory beneath its surface. It is a reminder that some forces are both ordinary and deadly, flowing through life unnoticed, teaching vigilance, humility, and respect. In the quiet of a city, at night, one senses how history whispers. Survival is never certain, and the smallest currents can carry the heaviest shadows. The world had barely begun to breathe after the devastation of war. Trenches still scarred the earth, smoke lingered over cities, and the scent of gunpowder mixed with the damp soil of battlefields. Europe, weary and fragile, longed for peace, for life to resume its gentle rhythm, and yet, even as nations counted their dead from human hands, an unseen enemy began to move among the living, a scourge far more indiscriminate, far more relentless than any cannon or rifle. The Spanish flu. It began quietly, whispered first among soldiers returning from the Western Front. A cough, a slight fever, a weariness that seemed beyond exhaustion. At first, it was dismissed as lingering fatigue, a shadow of war on human bodies already weakened. But the virus moved swiftly, invisibly, claiming bodies with a speed that rivaled the artillery it followed. Barracks, trains, and hospitals became breeding grounds. Cities, villages, and towns could not escape its reach. 1 week, the streets were crowded with life. The next, they were hushed, emptied of vitality, echoing with absence. What made this influenza extraordinary and terrifying was its cruelty toward the young and healthy. Soldiers, nurses, and mothers fell side by side with the elderly, their lungs filling with fluid, their strength evaporating in hours. Families could do nothing but watch, helpless, as those they loved convulsed, coughed, and faded into silence. Hospitals overflowed. Makeshift wards were set up in schools, town halls, and even tents. Coffins could not be procured fast enough. Corpses were stacked like firewood, their names recorded hastily, if at all. The pandemic's reach was global. Ships carried it across oceans. Troop movements scattered it further. From Europe to Asia, North America to the Pacific Islands, it crept through ports, railways, and homes alike. No continent was spared. Entire villages were emptied. Cities mourned tens of thousands in a single season, and yet the world had no vaccine, no antiviral remedy, only masks, isolation, and the fragile hope that some would survive. By 1920, it had passed, though it left an estimated 50 million dead in its wake. The world struggled to comprehend the scale of its toll. The way life had been altered not by bombs, but by air, breath, and proximity. the virus had respected neither borders nor hierarchy, teaching humanity a lesson in fragility and humility. Even now, in quiet corners of the globe, cemeteries hold the memory of the Spanish flu. Streets once silent now bustle with life, yet beneath the rhythm of daily existence, the shadow of 1918 lingers. It whispers that progress cannot shield us entirely, that even in peace, the world remains vulnerable to forces unseen, and that the breath we take, the air we share, may carry both life and its opposites, reminding us, always, of the delicate fragility of our existence.